Welcome to Liberty Starship, where we go beyond the typical terrestrial talk. I am Eric Alexander, along with Peter Maines. Together, we are your crew and invite you to join us on the journey to discuss politics and current events. Tonight, our main topics are going to be about the film Planet of the Humans and the Not So Green Deal, as well as Make America Resilient Again, managing COVID-19 and other crises in the future. But before that, we're going to actually get back to our old style of daily distractions. Previously, we've had to kind of just go with more sort of fun, silly stuff. But the original intention of this segment was always to kind of show some of the silly things that the media is covering as real news. So with that, Pete, can you get us into our first daily distraction?
Yeah, sure. You sometimes you just don't know what you have until it's gone. I think we're all kind of feeling that this week because suddenly Donald Trump's 3-hour press conferences are canceled for the foreseeable future. And I know this is what we all wanted. We love the Trump show. It's the most fun thing about having Donald Trump as president. And we've wanted him to have this Hugo Chavez style, almost Sábado Gigante type of show. And, where he would take questions, he would berate reporters, he talked about how amazing he was, and just be this 3-hour crazy press extravaganza. But we never even got to the really fun stuff. He never fired anybody, and that's his catchphrase, "You're fired." Dr. Fauci's still there, Dr. Birx is still there, and he never sang. Hugo Chavez at least sang. It just, this is what I've wanted since the very beginning, and I just worry that we didn't savor it enough. But the whole thing is the Trump show, as much as we make fun of it, it was a distraction. He wanted this to be a replacement for the kind of political rallies that he couldn't have because COVID-19. He can't go out and do his sort of stand-up style political rally. It just doesn't work. And we all know why it ended. It ended because of Bleachgate. It ended because he didn't quite say inject yourself with Lysol or bleach or whatever, but that's how it was interpreted. That's how it was filtered through the media to a lot of people. And he thinks it wasn't fair, and he thinks people are being mean to him. And we all feel very sorry for the president, whose self-aggrandizing press conferences haven't worked out the way that he had hoped. What this show is not just about the media, but about Trump and his most ardent defenders, is how focused they are on the wrong things. They're focused on demonizing or aggrandizing the president. What the president said was a little silly. I admit that. It was a little bit silly. Not nearly as silly as people are making it out to be. He didn't say inject yourself with bleach. It's kind of hard to tell what he was talking about. And then when people challenged him on it, he just kept digging the hole deeper and deeper. He had no common sense. He's not that good at playing the media. He wants us all to believe that he's the master of playing the media. It just hasn't worked out for him. His most ardent defender, Scott Adams, famously said, if 100 people look at exactly the same thing at the same time, they'll arrive at wildly different opinions of what they're seeing. And that's what we saw with Bleachgate. That we all heard it. We all heard what he said. And some people chose to interpret it charitably. And some people kind of said that was silly or that was nuts.
Well, I have to say that as much as I do agree with you that Trump has a tendency to fall into these landmines. In fact, that's why I generally don't watch his press briefings at all. I can find the highlights later on through other means. And a lot of the times it's just not that relevant. But at the same time, I have to admit that there's no doubt to me, in my mind, that the media leads him on into asking him questions that, maybe somebody else would say, okay, I'm not going to answer that question. And right. Trump feels obligated to answer it, despite the fact that clearly it's just meant to lead him into a landmine. And I still can't forget one of the highlights I saw where a reporter asked him, why don't we just shut down all the supermarkets? And that obviously is that was just a landmine question where they were trying to make him say something stupid. And he didn't because, of course, Trump has actually been pretty consistent, and he hasn't ordered any shutdowns. The CDC has made recommendations, but through the force of the federal government, we haven't had really any shutdowns at all, which I really commend him for. But I do think it's become quite a circus, and that's why, for the most part, I don't even listen to them. I don't watch them.
Yeah. But this is the actual quotation. Now, everybody is seeing something different in this, but this is what he actually said that everybody's arguing about. He said, "So I asked Bill a question some of you are thinking of if you're into that world, which I find to be pretty interesting. So supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light, and I think you said that hasn't been checked, but you were," and he's referring to Dr. Burks here, he says, "you're going to test it." And then I said, supposing it brought the light inside the body, which you can either do through the skin or some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that too. Sounds interesting. And I see the disinfectant where it knocks out in 1 minute. And is there a way you can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets into the lungs and it does a tremendous number on the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that out. So you're going to have to use medical doctors, but it sounds pretty interesting to me. So we'll see. But the whole concept of the light, the way it goes in 1 minute, that's the way it goes in 1 minute. That's pretty powerful. Now, I do not believe that Donald Trump has seen disinfectant knock out COVID-19 in a minute. He says, then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in 1 minute. And is there a way you can do something like that by injection inside? And that's why people are saying he's talking about
I think
disinfectant.
I think he clearly meant he's talking about literal disinfectant on a surface or something like that, and saying, is it possible to do something like that within the human body? Not necessarily with disinfectant. I think he meant as far as actually being able to do something along the same lines. That's the way I interpret it.
Yeah, it wasn't clear to me because he was talking about UV rays just before that, and so I thought maybe he's talking about that you have to get out and get sunlight, or it's so hard to tell. But he wants us to fill in the blanks. So he'll just throw stuff out there. It'll make no sense, and we're all supposed to be his press secretaries. We're all being deputized to make sense of whatever the heck he just said, and I find that offensive, and I don't like the way he communicates. It's not just that it's stupid. It's not just that it's obnoxious. It's that he expects us to run interference for him, and he's supposed to be the big communicator. He's supposed to be the marketing guru. Which is it? Are you able to stand on your own 2 feet and make yourself understood, or do you want us to make excuses for you? Because it can't be both ways. You know, my position is he's a big boy. If he wants to be the marketing guy, if he wants to be the salesman that he tells us that he is, then he needs to go out and do it. But I am sick of making excuses for him when he says that, we're maybe going to inject disinfectant. I don't. That's not my job.
No, I would agree with you. It's not. Absolutely not. But if he is looking for a new press secretary, hey,
Yeah.
Since he's kind of taken on the job himself, that is I think one of the problems is that he doesn't use his press secretary anymore. So his last press secretary he dismissed never did one press conference.
Now, was that the woman who was the PR agent for Melania?
I believe that's where she came from. I can't remember because she literally was never on TV even once. That's what I thought was funny, was like she was dismissed, and I think she's been press secretary for like a year, and she never conducted one press conference, not one. That's that's absolutely unprecedented. Absolutely unprecedented. So,
and allegedly she was Melania's press secretary before that, but we never saw her doing that either. So what did she do?
I don't know. I can't answer that question. I don't have that kind of insider information.
Oh, I think we're distracted enough. Do you have another item you want to throw up there?
Yes. And, CNN's been good to me with daily distractions. They really have. I always follow the rules, at least my little rule, which is it has to be on the main page. And before, I've been kind of going for the low-hanging fruit of the style section, But this was right there in the middle of all the news, like all the big stories, all the Corona stuff, all that kind of stuff. It was right there, just waiting for our show. So this article, the headline reads, Patriots rookie Justin Rohrwasser, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, but he says he will cover his controversial tattoo. So New England Patriots rookie kicker Justin Rohrwasser said Saturday he will cover up a controversial tattoo he got as a teenager. The tattoo on his left arm resembles the symbol of a right-wing group called the Three Percenters. Pete, do you remember the Three Percenters? Are you familiar with the Three Percenters?
Oh, yeah. I think we know people with 3%er tattoos.
I know many people with 3%er tattoos, as a matter of fact.
And
it's
they're not
actually,
all militiamen.
Yeah, and I think this is funny. I mean, so he says, I got the tattoo when I was a teenager, and I have a lot of family in the military. And that is absolutely one of the reasons people get these tattoos. It's very common in law enforcement and the military to wear 3%er garb and to have 3%er shirts. They often wear them underneath their body armor and all that kind of stuff. And to be fair, there is an actual 3%er organization, quote unquote, but the vast majority of people that support the movement, if you will, in terms of buying merchandise or getting a flag or getting a tattoo or getting a shirt, they have no affiliation with the group whatsoever, like zero. It's basically just they're sympathetic to the idea, which the idea is pretty simple, which is that at any one point during the American Revolution, only 3% of the population was engaged in active combat. These were the people that were actually literally fighting the American Revolution. That's it. That's the whole concept. And basically the idea that you want to be one of the 3%. If tyranny comes and something like that needs to happen again, the idea is that you will answer the call. That's it. That's the whole idea. And it means completely different things to different people. And it's probably, at this point, there's more than 3% of the population that support this concept, you know? So it's actually fairly popular, especially, I think, actually in Liberty circles, it's quite popular because I've seen it with people who are firefighters, police officers, military guys, and they are not right-wing nuts. So I just thought that this was kind of funny and interesting because I think even CNN, this article is so short. I mean, this is a really, really short article. You can see this, that's as far as it goes. And it even says at the end, on its website, the 3%ers said it's not a militia group. The reporter actually did put that in there. But again, most people that are not affiliated with the actual quote unquote organization, it's just an idea. It's sort of like just an ideology without a real party or anything like that. I can't speak to the actual group because I've never been a member. I've never gone to their meetings. I'm not sure if they even really have formal meetings, to be honest with you. But again, it's just a concept that people have that it's kind of like the people that wear like Mullen Labra, you know, or they have the Mullen Labra, you know, come and take it, you know,
Mullen
tattoo
latte.
or something like. Yeah, there we go. Sorry about that. My Greek's not that good. So I've only seen 300 about 100 times. So I own that film. But yeah, seriously, it's kind of the same thing. Yes, there is a group, there is a website, there is a guy that claims to have originated it. I am aware of that, but the vast majority of people that do this, they have nothing to do with that. They really don't. I just thought that was just kind of a silly thing. And now, in order to be a professional football player, he's going to have to cover up his offensive tattoo.
Right, and the reason why this is included in Daily Distractions because, of course, this is part of a larger media narrative. We were just talking about really kind of the Republicans' narrative, which is that poor Trump and we should feel sorry for him. That's a bunch of BS. And the left has their narrative that the president is stupid and he wants people to drink bleach. That's a bunch of BS. Well, you know, this story I think is pretty one-sided. It's simply that you have people on the left who want to demonize the military. And so you have this symbol that has a meaning within the military, within, you know, police, firefighter communities, and they don't like them. They're outsiders to the media. And so they're doing anything they can to discredit and disparage people who are in law enforcement and the military.
It kind of reminds me of a lot of the silliness about the Punisher logo, because there's a lot of police officers that were wearing the Punisher logo or military wearing the Punisher logo underneath their uniform. And that
Yeah.
became an issue at one point, which was just like, give me a break. It's a comic book character. You know what I mean? So, but did you have a more?
Well, I would say what it reminded me of was the circle game at Army Navy. Do you recall that? That you had
Yes,
these cadets
I
and
do.
midshipmen, yeah, and they were playing the circle game where
Yes,
you hold a
I,
circle down below your
I do.
waistline. You get somebody to look at it, and we all know what that
I
means.
do.
It's kind of
The
a
Army Navy game, quote unquote, contra. Yes, I.
yeah, and the idea is you're kind of making a sexual gesture. It's a little funny, it's a little naughty, it's but it absolutely is not a white supremacist thing. But the media loves to portray our military as being white supremacist skinheads, and it's just disgusting.
I couldn't agree with you more. Couldn't agree with you more. Now, did you have a more serious story for us for our news briefs?
Yeah, I've been beating the drum the past, I guess, couple weeks, maybe the entire time we've been doing the show, about how I think there's a lot of optimism about the economy right now, and it's just not warranted. We talked about the housing crisis. We talked about how right now everything seems fine. Everybody is paying their mortgages for the most part. People are paying their rent because people are getting unemployment. There's been bailouts. The banks have been shored up. But Bob Schiller, who created the Bob Schiller or the Case Shiller housing index, he teaches economics at Yale University. He's been saying that houses are overpriced, that they're at all-time highs. This isn't sustainable. This isn't sustainable, and we should see a crash. And he was saying this last September. He wasn't saying this since coronavirus broke out. He was saying last September that the housing market was in trouble. And so people are saying, "Oh, well, everything's going to be fine." We quoted that guy, and I believe it was Houston, who said, "Oh, my realtor told me just wait a couple of months and everything's going to turn around." Everything's not turning around. Carl Icahn, he's 85, he's kind of a Warren Buffett type, and he's made a bunch of money here actually in the past few weeks. He bought oil at negative prices because that's what I mean. Somebody had to do it, right? If the price of oil was negative $40 a barrel, he owns part of it was like an auto parts and refinery business that he owns, and so they cleared their tanks and they just took as much oil as they possibly could at negative prices. And I shared an article. I think you're sharing it now, but it's he predicts more economic turmoil, and he says the future is just too unpredictable for the S&P 500 to be trading at 17 times 2021 earnings estimates. You really cannot justify that multiple, Icahn said. Short term, you may have some big downdrafts. And I think this is right. He's also betting that commercial real estate is going to get hit hard. That's going to be first. It's going to be commercial real estate, then it'll be housing. But real estate in general is in big trouble. Already, we've seen REITs, those are real estate investment trusts for commercial real estate in New York City, has dropped by 50%. Because people, if they can leave New York City right now, they will. 20% of New York City has coronavirus. But it's not just about the coronavirus. These houses and office buildings and everything else was overpriced, like I said, last September. And nobody's taking this seriously. And the reason why nobody's taking this seriously, if you ask people either in the investment community or in the real estate industry, what they'll tell you is, well, we fixed the regulatory problems. What happened in 2007, 2008 was people were getting subprime mortgages because there weren't the regulations to prevent people from getting bad loans. And that's just not it. This argument, what this is going to come down to is whether monetary policy or regulation is what stabilizes the economy. My money and Bob Schiller's money, again, Robert Schiller is a Nobel laureate who predicted the 2007 housing crisis, who created the standard housing index and teaches at Yale University. He says the real estate market's in trouble. Carl Icahn, 85-year-old billionaire investment wizard, believes that real estate's in trouble. But everybody else it's just all happy talk. They think that everything is hunky dory, and we just have to wait this out, and we're gonna survive. And yeah, eventually the market will come back, but right now the investments, the fundamentals just aren't there. As you said, the price of the S&P right now is based on rosy predictions for next year, for 2021. That assumes that those rosy predictions are going to come true. And with this much uncertainty, how can you possibly value the stock market that high? So that's the big question.
Well, we've had a constant theme on our show that it, once again, people are using the pandemic as cover for their bad business practices that's been going on in some cases for decades, and a lot of that is starting to come to pass now because of the current crisis. But we've kind of maintained that a lot of the fundamentals were bad to begin with.
Yeah. The market dropped about 30% earlier this year, and then it's come back. So now we're only down 16% for the year. So we've gained about half back of what we lost, but it just doesn't make any sense. The fundamentals aren't there, earnings aren't there. The market is just foaming because we've dumped so much liquidity into the market, and that's not going to carry us forever. We said last week that the price of a house now is 5 times your annual salary, where it used to be double. It's now 5 times your annual salary, which is outrageous, absolutely outrageous. And we just accept it because we say, oh, interest rates are so low. Interest rates are so low.
One thing I've always wondered about when it comes to these kinds of issues, I see it in the stock market, I saw it in the real estate crash, with the Great Recession, is nothing seems to ever bottom out anymore, thanks to these stimuluses and everything like that. Like I've
Right.
kept a pretty close watch on the stock market through E-Trader, looking for those quote unquote bargain stocks, and I can tell you, all you got to do is look at that little ticker that gives you that 52-week window, tells you what the lowest price of the stock has been in the last year, and guess what? Most of these stocks aren't there. They're not even at their lowest point, in the last year, the last 52 weeks. They're still trading above that. And that to me is just that's pure inflation. That's all that stimulus money that was thrown in there, and these stocks are overvalued. There's just no way to get around that. With everything going on, how can these stocks still have greater value than they did, say 6 months ago, or even a year ago? That's just, it's not possible. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and Robert Schiller, he made this excellent point that normally when a recession happens, it's because you have a panic, and so it's largely psychology. The run up is built on psychology because people are very overly optimistic, and then you have a big crash, and everybody becomes overly pessimistic, and the recovery usually doesn't happen until people lose hope for a recovery. And when people are sort of used to the new normal, then the market recovers. But he says this is different. This isn't psychology. This isn't the madness of crowds. This is like a real life plague of locusts. Something real and tangible has happened to the economy to shut down the economy. And we're acting like this is just a normal boom and bust. And the things we've tried in the past are going to bring us back, and things are going to be better in the fall. And he just doesn't see it.
No, I don't see it either. Like I said, I think many of the weaknesses have been exposed, and they're just gonna get worse. And propping everything up with the national credit card, I don't think is going to help. I think it's going to cause inflation eventually. So
Yeah, it's going to work for a month or two, and then we're going to see reality is going to set in. Unemployment benefits aren't going to last forever.
very true. Are we okay with me doing my news brief? Pete?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. So I've got this one is going to be pretty quick. Right before I go into my main segment, I think that this in some ways kind of relates to my main segment, actually, because this is certainly an issue that environmentalists seem to have a lot of opinions on. So this is actually from a local news station in the state where I live, from ABC 15 News, and it says meat processing plants shutting down nationwide, possible devastating impact on Arizona ranchers. And I'll be honest with you, I've lived in Arizona most of my life, and I was not even aware that ranching was that big of a thing in Arizona. So it says
Oh,
concern is spreading among Arizona ranchers as meat packing plants across the country continue to close, with workers falling ill with coronavirus. Several meat processing facilities have closed across the country in recent weeks, ranchers told ABC 15. This has created an oversupply of livestock, which has led to a sharp decrease in cattle prices and has threatened profits. And so basically, what's happening right now is these ranchers are basically selling their beef at bargain basement prices. And this could wipe them out. We're talking about, I think, a lot of smaller ranchers. We're not talking about the huge commercial ranchers necessarily, although they'll obviously be affected as well. But it's kind of like a perfect storm because, on the one hand, you have all these processing centers that have been infected with the COVID-19, and they're literally shutting down. They're literally shutting down the slaughterhouses, and so getting the meat to market is becoming more and more difficult. And when they do get it to market now, they're facing much. They're in a classic oversupply issue where they have got too much meat and not enough processing capability to deal with the meat. And this relates also to Congressman Massey's Prime Act, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, Pete, but he's
no.
been advocating for that for years. And basically, what the Prime Act is all about is to try to allow intrastate commerce, basically take away all the federal regulations for intrastate. In other words, if you're not going out of state and you're simply perhaps you're trying to get your beef to the local farmers market. Basically, what Massey's trying to do is get those federal regulations out of the way. It doesn't stop the states from having their own regulations. They can regulate as much as they want. But what it does is it makes it a little bit easier for the rancher to get beyond that middleman where they're getting directly to the consumer so they can sell some of this excess beef instead of euthanizing their cattle or other extreme means to deal with the oversupply issue. And this is something that's funny. Again, Massey's been advocating for this for years. He has bipartisan support on the issue. But it's like now the cows are really coming home, literally, where it's like, we need this right now. This would be very, yep, the chickens are coming home to roost. And these ranchers are in dire need of this kind of reform. My brother actually goes to our local farmers market. And I'm lucky enough to live in a state where our farmers market has not been affected. We haven't been shut down by a tyrannical governor or a tyrannical mayor. So it's a nice thing, and it's something that should be supported. And with people that talk about wanting to go green and all those kinds of things, well, I think this is a great way to quote unquote dial down your carbon footprint. Massey, in a video I saw, describes, because he raises cattle and sells them. He talks about the process of having to go to an FDA approved processor that's like 3 hours away from his house, when there's a local there's a local processor, a local slaughterhouse that doesn't have an FDA guy there all the time, and he can't use them. He just can't use them unless he's doing all this other different kinds of things. It's an interesting issue, and it's one that's kind of exposing, again, some of these kind of flaws that were already there. In this case, in something that's absolutely essential, which is the food chain, with the food supply chain. And a lot of people have been concerned about this, and this is potentially something that could cause some real havoc, not just for the ranchers, but for people in general, in terms of just getting meat, having meat available.
Yeah, I saw on Facebook today, somebody was saying that they were buying, I don't know if it was a side of beef or an entire cow, but they were buying it directly from the rancher in Arizona. I suppose you throw that cow or the meat on the back of your truck and you drive it back to Phoenix and hope it's okay on the hour, 2 hour, 3 hour drive. I guess that's what you have to do, but everybody in Arizona can't consume all of this beef if they're exporting it, unless, I don't know, you're having hamburgers and steak every day. You just have to go. You're going to go beef crazy if we're going to keep the farmers afloat.
Well, one thing that Massey explained was, under the current system, the way they do it is literally they freeze pretty much the entire cow and give you the entire thing. And that's the only way they can do it. And he mentioned that the only people that can really afford that are wealthy people with huge walk-in freezers and things like that, that they're the only people that can really deal with that. The individual person can't. So obviously what the individual person wants is just a couple pounds of a prime cut, or maybe they want hamburger or whatever it is that they want, whatever cut they want. And that's it. They want a couple pounds and want to go home. Under the current regulations, the current regime, that's just not possible with your local rancher. It just doesn't happen because of the FDA and federal regulations. You just can't do that.
Sure, but right now the farmers are really in a bad spot. They have to dump these, and they're dumping these cows at not quite pennies on the dollar, but at deep discounts because of precisely what you said. Most people can't afford to buy that much beef at a time at whatever it is, $5 or $10 a pound, depending on the quality, I suppose. But yeah, they're taking a bath, so they're willing to sell it for far below the normal market price, just because the alternative is to get nothing for these cows.
Yeah, exactly. So they're kind of stuck between the rock and the hard place.
Yep, bad situation, and this is exactly the kind of dislocation that we were worried about. As you know, as we've been talking about, people are saying, "Oh, the economy's fine; it's going to bounce back." But what do you do about these farmers that suddenly they can't get people to process their meat, or they can't get people to pick their vegetables, and so they're rotting, and they're depending, especially if you have farm fields. You know, you don't have you're not picking crops every single day. There are seasons when you need to pick crops, and there are seasons when you're growing. And so if you miss one of your harvests, that's an enormous hit. You're probably not economically prepared for that.
Yeah, this article actually talked about that a lot of these ranchers, they only have 2 or 3 times a year to make money.
Yeah.
Based, I guess, on the age and stuff of their herd and all that kind of stuff. So it's the same kind of situation.
Yeah, so it's a third or half your income for the year is just gone.
Exactly, or severely reduced if you're lucky.
Yeah.
All right. I think I'm ready to go into my main topic. You ready for this, Peter?
Oh, I sure am.
I know you've been waited with bated breath. So a lot of people may have heard of the film Planet of the Humans. This is a Michael Moore film. He is the executive producer. He is not the director. He did not actually film this. And as far as I know, he actually had very little involvement with the actual production, but it's something that he has gone ahead and decided to produce and promote. And so it's kind of funny to me. This particular film has caused a really interesting reaction with people. And it's kind of funny. Almost, you kind of think that because this is supposed to be, clearly like a pro-environmentalist kind of film. And yet many of the most extreme environmentalists are extremely upset with this film. And at the same time, some of your very hard right people are somewhat enamored with the film. And so I'm going to start out here with a little article from, I can get these ads to go away. There we go. Give me 1 second here. I hate these pop-ups. All right, so we've got this article from USA Today, and it says, Michael Moore teases shocking new documentary. Says coronavirus is a warning from Mother Nature. So during an appearance on MSNBC Sunday, the filmmaker, who's now 66, shared how the coronavirus pandemic is related to the themes of Planet of the Humans, which examines climate change and the green energy movement. It says, quote, "We are in dangerous shape here. This pandemic should act as a warning from Mother Nature that our behavior is not appreciated," he said. "And the fact that we have treated the species on this planet, species that oftentimes give us these viruses, it's a failure of us, all of us who call ourselves environmentalists." And it says Moore acted as the executive producer, and the team included his director, Jeff Gibbs, who spent almost a decade researching and documenting the topic. And I have to be honest with you, I know very little about Jeff Gibbs. other than what he talks about in the documentary itself. So let's talk about this film, Planet of the Humans. I know, Pete, you have not seen this film, correct?
I've just seen an ad for it. I wasn't even sure what it was. I thought it was maybe like a satire or something.
Well, it's an interesting film. You know, Michael Moore himself, of course, always involves satire in his films. But again, I don't know exactly how much involvement he really had. I feel like he kind of came in at the end and said, "Hey, I'll promote this film for you. You know, this is my buddy, and I like it, and let's do that." In fact, I've heard people that were involved in this documentary were involved in Michael Moore's previous documentaries, and were on camera even talking about this film, which apparently took years and years and years to finish. And it's a very interesting film, and it starts out in a way that I think a lot of people, quite frankly, on both sides of the issue, would understand, and you would actually be like, okay, you know, I get that. That makes a lot of sense, because the way he starts out is something that I say to my own children all the time when we're talking about green energy and electric cars and things like that. One of the first things I always say when we talk about an electric car is, well, you know, the electric car is not going to help you very much if it's powered, if you're powering it with a coal plant. You're recharging it because the grid is on a coal plant. And a lot of people, I think, get that concept, and yet they don't. And that's kind of one of the places that this film starts out in. And I think a lot of reasonable people would be like, well, that makes sense. And that's part of the story that's not really being told as much as it probably should be. Because a lot of people just assume, hey, if you have an electric car, it's quote unquote more green, and it causes less carbon emissions and all these other things that people that care about the environment think is important. But the fact of the matter is, as far as its actual carbon footprint, you're not really saving anything. So it comes down to, so what's the alternative? You know, how else can we power the grid, right? And so, of course, we've heard these discussions before, you know, all over the place from both sides about where you get that energy. So the first place he goes to is the quote unquote cleanest alternative, which is he goes to solar power and wind. I mean, everybody says that's just the cleanest thing in the world, right? There's no downside to solar power and wind, except there is, because you have to build the solar panels and you have to build the wind turbines. And people forget this. They forget about the energy that is expended to do this, and they forget about the materials that are used to do this. One of the things that they mentioned in the documentary, which I found interesting, was that a great deal of solar panels are not made with sand, which of course we think of sand as absolutely the most renewable, renewable material on the planet because it's so excessive, it's everywhere. But they say that a lot of these solar panels are actually made with quartz, very fine quartz that has to be mined and torn from the earth. And of course, this is something that you would think most environmentalists would be very upset about. And yet it's something that they are indirectly supporting because they want these highly efficient solar panels, which you need highly efficient solar panels to actually do any good, so you can power that so you can actually charge an electric car. But the problem becomes, you can't charge that electric car with a solar powered grid at night. And that's when you're supposed to be charging the car, right? Is when you're not going to work. You charge it overnight. Well, guess what? Your solar panels don't work at night. So the issue becomes, well, maybe we could use wind, right? You know, that's kind of the idea. You know, we have a cloudy day. We hope that there's some wind picking up, and we can use the wind turbines to go ahead and do that. Well, unfortunately, sometimes the wind's not there either. So what do they do? Well, in a lot of cases, they go to coal or they go to natural gas. And it's pretty interesting to see the amount of, they don't spend a lot of time on natural gas, although they clearly don't like it. What they actually end up spending a lot of time on is one of the other alternatives, which is biomass fueling, doing things like wood chips and things like that, which quite honestly, I think that absolutely does have a place in our energy grid and energy scenario. Having it be sort of the primary way of powering the economy, I kind of actually agree with the filmmaker, would be disastrous, because you're talking about massive deforestation that would be needed to provide enough wood chips in order to actually replace coal. Because quite frankly, coal is extremely efficient in terms of the amount of it to the amount of energy you get, the amount you pull out and the amount of energy you get from it. And these other forms of energy, they're really lacking in that regard, because there's a lot that you have to do. There's a lot of rare earth minerals and things like that are involved in the building of these things, and any electronics. And these things have to be, they're only found in certain places. That they're called rare earth minerals for a reason, because they're very difficult to find and they're difficult to mine. And the mining operations, of course, are something that you would think most environmentalists would be absolutely appalled. They'd be appalled by it. But again, they're indirectly supporting this. So it's an interesting documentary, and I find the reaction to it very interesting because, again, you have these people. I've seen articles of people that I would say are more or less on the extreme right, sort of almost praising this movie. And I think it's only based on a few scenes, like what I'm kind of talking about. And then you have people that are directly. I saw a post from someone from the Green Party talking about what a misleading and terrible film this is, and how Michael Moore has basically betrayed all of the environmentalists and the environmental movement, and he's a disgrace, and they've completely turned on him, which is really interesting to see how polarizing it is. Now, when you see something that polarizing, my take is, well, maybe there is something here. I'm not going to sit here and endorse the entire film and say that I agree with him, especially because he's very, very against biomass. In fact, that's probably what he goes up against the most, even with all the stuff that he talks about solar and even quote unquote passive solar, which he shows is a big scam, because they still have to use fossil fuels in order to get the generators going and all that kind of stuff. It's really kind of interesting when they break down some of these things. But in terms of actual alternative energy sources, he doesn't really offer a solution. In fact, going back to the beginning of this, when I started talking about this article and the quotes from Michael Moore, you really get the impression that his solution is, we just need to kill off some people. And he doesn't say that in the film, but you certainly get that impression. You get that impression from the article I just read, where Michael Moore is saying that basically COVID-19 is Mother Nature's way of putting us in check, to paraphrase. But I understand the meaning. They don't say that outright in this film, but clearly that's part of the message, is that there are just too many people on the planet, and the population is not sustainable. And again, they don't offer a solution. They just say that that's basically the situation, and we have to deal with it. There's this interesting scene in the film where the filmmaker, the director, talks about accepting our mortality, and the fact that accepting our mortality is essential to actually making some sort of impact on climate change and all that kind of stuff. And, I can read between the lines, and I can understand where they're going with that. And there are other cultural institutions and TV shows that are trying to give the same narrative, that we need to accept our mortality. And that means that we need to be more accepting of death, right? That's the bottom line. It's kind of a strange thing that, and I feel like almost there's no coincidence that they decided to release this on YouTube. Yes, it was for Earth Day. Originally, they said it was for Earth Day. But this film, I think, came out in June of last year, I want to say, something like that. It's actually been out for a while. I suppose it's been like on the film festival circuit and things like that. They only decided to release it on YouTube on Earth Day, and it's still out now, as far as I know. And I can't help but think that there's no coincidence that they decided, what, with this corona going on, maybe we can get our meaning out there a little bit better. We can kind of imply the things that we want to imply a little bit more, that we're not willing to outright just state and say. But the other thing that's really interesting about this is that it's a huge indictment on the entire environmental, I guess, corporate, I would say, movement. The Sierra Club is hit really hard in this film. So it's really kind of, in a lot of ways, all over the place. And it really is saying that the Green New Deal is a bunch of crap, that the Green New Deal is just not going to work, and it's actually going to make things worse. And again, you're kind of left of, well, what's the solution? And I feel like their solution, I mean, look at the name. It's Planet of the Humans. And that's a takeoff of Planet of the Apes, obviously. They even use a logo that's very similar to the Planet of the Apes film, the classic Planet of the Apes film. And they present at the beginning of the film, can a planet endure if one species becomes dominant? You know, and that's the kind of a central question that they put out there. And of course, the answer is no. And the question becomes, well, where does that leave you? Where does that leave you if that's your assumption that no, we cannot allow one species to be dominant? So it's an interesting film, and like I said, it's got some elements in there that I think most people, even on separate sides, quote unquote, of the issue, I think would understand and agree with. But it comes to some very, very bizarre conclusions, and it's kind of making everybody angry in one way or another.
Well, that can't be all bad. I would say when you have a group like the Sierra Club or any of these environmentalist groups, yes, they're interested in the environment, but they're also interested in consistency. They're also interested in their brand. And so as facts come out and previous positions that they took are contradicted or the evidence no longer supports what they used to believe in, they're not going to turn on a dime and say, well, this technology is good or this technology is bad. We should do this. And when we said before, we should do that, because they don't want to look foolish and they have to be credible in front of their donors. And they may have other interests besides purely the environment. If we're being honest, they're partisan. And so going after things that are supported by Republicans is just kind of part of their MO. Not because it's good for the environment, but things like nuclear energy, which we know is good on balance for the environment. Well, Republicans support that, so we can't possibly support that. And I think as far as clean energy goes, right now with oil as cheap as it is, and it was inexpensive before, but as cheap as it is right now, you're not going to see much investment over the next few years into green energy. It's just not going to happen because the incentive isn't there. The next time the price of oil skyrockets, people will start investing again in solar, start investing again in biomass and all these other technologies. But for right now, green energy is dead for the time being. That's just the way it is.
Well, the funny thing is, at least the position that they take in the film is that's you're probably better off that way. So it's just kind of a funny thing because that they're one of their main positions in this film is that a lot of these supposed green energies, because of all the hidden costs, it would just be easier to just use more traditional coal, a coal generator or something like that. That would actually have less of a impact. I'm sorry, less of a carbon impact than what they're doing now, because it's very much sort of a hodgepodge hybrid system, if you will, kind of like a hybrid car, right? Hybrid car has an elaborate battery, but it also has an engine to keep the battery going to recharge it. Um, that's kind of what they're talking about. It's very much the same principle that a lot of these supposedly, even solar farms and a lot of these other places, the wind turbine things, they have to be supplemented by something because again, they've got those physical limitations of no sun, no power, no wind, no power. You know, so that's not to say that's universal. By the way, I am aware that there are some means out there to try to store that energy better. And I'm not talking about batteries because batteries have their own inherent problems as far as sustainability and as far as what do you do with it when the battery is no more and no longer works because these batteries don't last forever. But
Right.
there are other creative ways to deal with this problem. It's just that for the most part, that's not what they do. That's not the
Right. You
way
have
it
to mine the
works.
metals for the metal that's inside of the battery. And you think, okay, well, that's a one-time cost in terms of carbon footprint. But it's a non-trivial cost. And so even over the life of your car, if you have a car with a Li-ion battery, it's an electric car, the carbon footprint of mining that of those mining those minerals may be greater than the exhaust you will let out of your car.
Exactly. Exactly.
And here's another thing that I don't think that the green energy movement realizes, and maybe they are aware of this, but there are a number of research groups and have been for a long time who are looking into how can we get bacteria to produce fuel. And that fuel will essentially be something like petroleum, something like the gasoline in your car. Maybe it'll be more like the green oil, the biofuel that you get that is made from ethanol from corn or whatever, right? But when that happens, I don't see any way that wind and solar and all these other types of energy long term are going to be able to compete. Once we can scale up the production of bacteria fueled oil production, and we're turning our plastic waste back into petroleum, I think it's game over for the green energy movement.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm not very familiar with that technology, but that's definitely interesting.
Yeah. They have been able to get it to produce like oils for food. So it's producing food products right now, but that's about it. But it's coming. It may be 20 years, maybe 30 or 50, but it's coming.
Interesting. Now, Pete, did you have your main segment that you wanted to get into?
Yeah, we talk a lot about sustainability and on the political, yeah, on the political side, we haven't talked a lot about resilience. There's so many stories about the coronavirus where people are indulging in conspiracy theories. We've talked about the Bill Gates bashing, that Bill Gates wants to impose martial law and he wants to give you mandatory vaccinations. And that's utter nonsense. Bill Gates had nothing to do with unleashing the coronavirus. And the very idea that Bill Gates could impose martial law and mandate vaccines is pathological. It doesn't make any sense. And it is just our subconscious is afraid of something. And we've chosen Bill Gates to be the boogeyman. And on the other side, you have people who are so adamant that this is the Black Death, and it isn't. We don't know exactly how deadly coronavirus is, but we're reaching a point where we can start opening the economy again. But what makes me angry is because we have the extremes driving the narrative and driving the conversation, we're not taking the necessary precautions. We're not learning any lessons from this. We are learning nothing, as far as I can tell, from the coronavirus. What we should be learning is that we need to be more resilient. We need to be more prepared. When the coronavirus, it really got real for people, the first thing that happened was the prepper stores were sold out immediately. You'd think they'd have seen that coming. You'd think they'd be prepared, but they just weren't. And so they so and that was the case with everything. N95 masks, we didn't have enough. Ventilators, we didn't have enough. Nurses, hospitals, hospital beds, doctors, we didn't have enough. And we need to think, what about the next time this happens? What if it's not? I don't believe that coronavirus is benign, but we were saying if you assume a 0.5% mortality rate, 0.5%, that's about 2 million Americans, 1.5, 2 million Americans. Right now, we've seen 50,000 deaths to coronavirus, and we've seen the morgues overflowing in New York City. If we really did see something that caused 2 million deaths in short order, there would be absolute pandemonium on the streets of the United States right now. It would be chaos. And so, why aren't we prepared for this? And now that we're seeing the number of deaths start to recede, it looks like maybe we're finally starting to see that crest here in the United States. Why are we doing stupid things like sending ventilators overseas? Last night and the night before, President Trump was on Twitter bragging that he was sending ventilators that we use the Defense Production Act, the DPA, to produce. We got GM to produce them, and now we're sending them overseas. Like we can't think two steps ahead, and it drives me nuts. He said, "Just spoke to President Nayib Bukele of El Salvador. We will be helping them with ventilators, which are desperately needed. They've worked well with us on immigration at the southern border." I just want to scream. No, The fact that he's, first of all, that he's treating it like these are our ventilators, like he's doing them a favor. He's just sending them. This is the taxpayers paid for that, and he's sending them to El Salvador. And the next tweet is about Honduras. Just spoke to President Juan Orlando Hernandez of the Republic of Honduras. We work closely together on the southern border. Again, the southern border. He's turning this into something about the wall, something about immigration. It's not about him. What happened to America first? What happened to, we want to have the ventilators just in case we need them, because we're trying to reopen the country and we expect that we're going to need more ventilators. We're going to need more hospital beds. And he's sending them to other countries. Next, President Lenin Moreno of the Republic of Ecuador. Ventilators, of which we have recently manufactured many, and helping them in other ways. They are fighting hard against coronavirus. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali of Ethiopia. This country needs ventilators, and the U.S. is in good position to help them. We will. Why can't we think a step ahead? We're not scaling up tests fast enough, or at least we haven't. Finally, this week, I was just looking through the headlines, looking through the news stories. We're starting to see LabCorp is producing 50,000 tests per day. Okay, that's a pretty good amount, and that's we're starting to reach the point where we're able to produce enough to get decent samples, so we have a sense of how deadly this really is. But before, we're just flying blind because we have no idea how many people have this disease. We don't know if the mortality rate is 5% or 1%. If it's 5%, and we're expecting, what would that be? 5 to 6 million, 10 to 12 million dead Americans. That's that's insane. No, sorry, that's 15 to 20 million dead Americans. There's no common sense right now that we're just giving away, ventilators, where people, when I bring up we need to train more nurses because we don't have enough capacity, so that when an emergency strikes, that we have enough nurses, we have enough hospital beds. People say, well, no, right now the nurses aren't very busy. Yeah, because we've delayed non vital surgery, non-emergency surgeries. We shouldn't have to do that. Okay, if somebody's in a lot of pain, even if it's not an emergency, even if they're not going to die tomorrow, we shouldn't deny them a hospital bed. We shouldn't deny them treatment. But we can't do everything all at once. And so we've flattened the curve, and we've brought nurses and doctors out of retirement to deal with this. We've built up some capacity, but instead of opening up the economy, we're not even thinking about this. We're just living in the moment, and we can't think 2 seconds ahead. And this is true, I think, especially of the Democrats, who are so obsessed with flattening the curve, but they don't want to open up the economy. They don't understand the point of flattening the curve is so that we would be able then to open the economy later. It's not so we can just lock down the whole country until we find a vaccine, because that may never happen. We built
For a lot of Democratic politicians, the point of the lockdown is so they can institute a UBI. I've seen that chatter. So I mean, I think that's very clear. That's why some of them want the shutdown. They want people to be out of work, and they want them to be dependent on that government cheese.
Yeah, give a man a free house. That's a good song. I think you're right. A lot of people are exploiting this crisis to impose pie in the sky ideas like UBI. And the thing is, what they're saying is that, well, we were able to send everybody a $1,200 check, so why don't we do that every week, or at least every month? Well, the reason is because we can't afford it. The reason is we can put this on the credit card now, but we can't.
We couldn't afford it now. That's
Yeah. What I mean? Yeah, we put on the credit card, but if we did it every month, I mean, we just the economy would collapse. Our debt, we'd have to default on our debt. It'd be absolute madness. It's like saying, well, I went to the Ritz-Carlton for vacation. It was $700 a night. Well, why don't I just live at the Ritz-Carlton? Maybe because you're not wealthy enough to do that. There's a difference between something you can do for a very short period of time and something you can do every day. You can take somebody out for a steak dinner on their birthday, but that doesn't mean you can afford to go to Ruth's Chris Steakhouse every night of the year. It just, no, and this is what I mean. Nobody's thinking ahead. Nobody is able to plan. This should be a wake up call that we're not prepared for crises like this, that we're not thinking ahead, that next time when it's worse, because sometime it will be worse. People were saying that maybe this was cooked up in a lab in Wuhan, China. Well, I don't know that that's true, but let's say it was. Do we think that the Chinese government, which is threatening to invade Taiwan, which is killing its own citizens in Xinjiang, which is killing protesters in Hong Kong, which is stealing land from the Philippines and what's called the Cow's Tongue, taking all these little islands and all their minerals in the China Sea, who is threatening to kill Americans in Guam to eliminate our presence in the Pacific. Do we really believe that the Chinese authoritarian dictatorship would be unwilling to use biological weapons at some point in the future? I don't see any reason why they wouldn't. It's not as though they are grounded in some kind of moral philosophy that would preclude doing something that awful. They don't seem to have and I know we dropped nuclear weapons on Japan, but we were fairly divided over that as a country, right? We really struggled. We continue to struggle over was that the right thing to do. But China doesn't have that kind of moral foundation. Their culture is so very different that I can't imagine them losing any sleep at all over unleashing biological warfare on the enemies they think are preventing them from taking their rightful place as the Middle Kingdom. So my point is this: we need to get back to being prepared. I was looking for this old Will Rogers quote that he says that America is the only country that doesn't prepare for war until we're in it. And I don't remember the exact words, but I couldn't find it. But that was the gist of what he said, because that's what we do. And unfortunately, he died before World War II, but he was very much proven right on that. We are right now. We are seeing that we are unprepared for the next battle, which may be a biological weapon or may just be a pandemic. It may not be a state actor, but we're simply not prepared to scale up our nurses. We spend $1 trillion every year on healthcare at the federal level, $1 trillion every year on healthcare, and yet we're not doing what it takes to increase the number of nurses, increase the number of doctors, which would be a much smaller investment than simply paying everybody's medical bills, because we don't think ahead. We don't think about capacity. We do everything on the demand side and not on the supply side. And then we complain that there's a nursing shortage, that there's a shortage of doctors. And well, we better import doctors and nurses from other countries because Americans won't do those jobs. And that's a load of nonsense. We bring engineers from overseas because, oh, Americans can't or won't do science jobs. And that's a load of nonsense. We're not prepared. We are spending all of this money on other things, on subsidizing liberal arts educations that aren't adding much value to the economy. I mean, look, I think liberal arts has a lot of value. The humanities have a lot of value, but if we're saying that we have a shortage of scientists, maybe instead of subsidizing all of these softer degrees, maybe we should be investing that money in things that will prop up the American economy and make the American economy resilient again. Mark Andreessen has just published a new article, and he's written up a national review that the American economy is too focused on financialization and not on building things. And again, that's true. We had to deputize General Motors to build ventilators because we don't build ventilators; we import ventilators. I'm not big on, I believe in free trade and I believe in markets. But when it comes to national security, we can't rely on China to be our supplier because they're our strategic rival. If we go to war, i- I mean, what other country would it be? If there is a global conflict, what other country? If we went to war, if we've had a lot of conflicts over the past 20 years within our lifetime. We've been at war with Serbia in the Balkans. We've gone to war with Iraq. We've gone to war with the Taliban in Afghanistan. None of those countries. It doesn't matter if we had countries before, like we know from Iraq, we got oil from other places. We weren't that dependent on Iraq. But with China, right now, we're very dependent on them because they're such a big trading partner, and we're finding that they're more and more dangerous. And even more importantly than that, what Andreessen and Peter Thiel, who Peter Thiel was, he's a big tech investor, German immigrant, Trump supporter. He spoke at the Republican National Convention in 2016. He has been talking about this, that we don't build physical things anymore. We have a lot of tech companies in the United States and we have a lot of banks, but we don't build physical things. And why don't we? Because that's where progress has to happen. If we're going to improve the material condition of our society, we have to produce things instead of just outsourcing it. And Andreessen specifically was saying we focused a lot on efficiency over the past few generations, a lot on efficiency, but we're not inventing new things. We're not inventing new airplanes. For the airplane, when it was invented, was a real game changer for the economy. And likewise, um, the telephone, and we all kind of remember the golden age of invention. And then in World War II, we built a lot of factories because we were the only country that wasn't embroiled. The World War II largely happened off of our shores, not on our shores. So unlike Britain and France and our other allies, China was our ally at that time, we didn't have to worry about our factories being seized by enemy armies or about our workers necessarily going overseas. Although we did have a lot of women who entered the workforce to make up for the men who went overseas. But the point is, we were the world's factory during World War II and in the decades after that. But starting in the 1970s, we got away from innovating and got towards being more efficient. And we've forgotten that we need to have manufacturing jobs here. We need to be productive again. And that's why I say make America resilient again. And this is something that the president has talked about. And it's kind of, I think, just under the surface of a lot of the things he says. He has talked about how we need to build things. We don't want jobs to go over to China. But I think we need to look at, and I want to develop this more in the coming weeks. We should look at Germany as sort of a model, that Germany has a lot of manufacturing jobs. For a developed country, they are very high in the rankings of countries. I think they're number 2 or 3 in countries of how much they produce relative to GDP. And the way they've done it is they don't worry about mass producing a bunch of cheap items like China does, because that's China's niche and their workers are very educated. So they're not going to compete in the low rent market. Now, we produce a lot of things that are sort of high rent. We produce a lot of aircraft, for example, and we have some car factories and stuff like that. But we have our niche, but it's not a very big niche. It's a swing for the fences niche. Germany has produced a lot of high paying manufacturing jobs by focusing on sort of the middle tier. And how did they do it? Well, they focus on quality. If you buy something that's German made, and not this isn't always the case, but usually if you buy something that's German made, like German power tools or what have you, Siemens produce a lot of medical equipment. It's high quality. It's German engineering. We know that phrase, German engineering. Everybody wants that. And when people go to school, we produce a good number of engineers, but their education system, unlike ours, in our system, you go to high school with the expectation that you are going to go to college, and we want you to go to college. We want everybody to go to college. And what we don't do is say, okay, some people are going to be plumbers or electricians. And those are needed jobs. Those should be high paying jobs. Those should be well respected jobs. And so their culture is different. How the way they treat people who work with their hands is different. They respect them, which is good because those are people who make your country strong. I don't. Boy, I hear myself right now. I have to admit, I was born in Germany. Uh, Look, I think the German model makes a lot of sense. Not everybody can be a programmer. If for no other reason than programming is the kind of job that's going to be automated away long term. The point is you write software so that you don't have to do the job. So that way you have a few people write software so the computers can do a lot of tasks for all of us, but we're not doing it over and over again. And so, but what are we going to need? Well, we're going to need more plumbers. We're going to need more electricians. We're going to need more nurses and doctors because our population is getting older. Older people get sicker. And we're saying there's a nursing shortage. We're saying there's a doctor shortage, but we're not increasing the number of spots in our medical schools and our nursing schools nearly fast enough. So their education system makes sense. They focus on the right niche, which is middle tier, not swing for the fences and not produce a bunch of cheap crap. And the final thing they do is they have hard money. They have hard money. They balance their budget and they don't try to inflate away debt because they have this history of the Weimar Republic that they don't want to repeat the hyperinflation they faced in the 1920s and 30s. And there's one more thing before we get off here. It's already 8:15. Resilience isn't just about the economy. It's also about our culture. We need to focus on family. You know, our families have the American family has taken a real beating in previous decades. And I know you and I have both been affected by it. And but also if we look at the political level, everything in the Bill of Rights we sort of take for granted now that the founding fathers just had these ideas and that it was based in they just thought, well, we don't want government to do these bad things, and it just sprang fully formed from James Madison's head like Venus from the head of Jupiter. But the fact is everything in the Bill of Rights came from experience. Just look at the First Amendment. The right to assemble, the freedom of religion, there shall be no established religion, freedom of worship, freedom of speech. All these things were reactions to actual abuses by the British government, by the Crown, and by Parliament. Right now, we're seeing a lot of, you've said it before in this hour already, that a lot of these governors want to impose UBI. They want an excuse to lock down their city, to impose all kinds of regulations just to see what the extent of their power is. What about a new Bill of Rights? I don't mean get rid of the old one, but how about, especially at the state level or in our local city charters, how about we start thinking seriously about these emergency laws, these emergency orders? Because right now, when an emergency happens, it's completely within your mayor or your governor's discretion, apparently, because the courts aren't striking this down. We haven't heard of any successful lawsuits. Very, very few. Some of the abuses have been struck down by the courts. But where is the movement to rein in these governors? We've heard just a little tiny bit about the Michigan legislature, but why does the governor of Arizona, for example, have the ability to tell businesses that they're not allowed to reopen? And you have the city of Chandler right now, Chandler, Arizona, which is in the Phoenix metro area, and it's a very technologically savvy city. It's a fairly wealthy city in the Phoenix area. They want to reopen. They want to reopen now because we haven't had any deaths recently. They feel like they have capacity, that it's time, the curve has been flattened. It's time to reopen Chandler, Arizona. But they can't do it because they have to ask permission of the governor. Why do we allow that? We need to modify the Arizona state constitution so that when a city is safe, that the governor can't just shut down the entire state economy as though he has the answer for everybody. We need to let people on the ground, people in
unfortunately, the other side of that, though, Pete, is that we had many mayors that actually preempted what the governor was doing.
That's
particularly
right.
In Flagstaff, in Tucson, in Phoenix. I always call them the usual suspects. They followed the LA model, which we covered on a previous episode. Again, I'm quite proud of that coverage because we talked about how LA was doing this and everybody was going to follow it, and that's what happened. Major cities in Arizona did it, and then the governor decided he had to do something. It goes both ways. Just kind of like before when I've talked about the 10th Amendment versus the 14th Amendment. This is federalism in action. So you have to look at both the ability of the central government in order to impose itself, on behalf of the citizens for freedom, and vice versa. Local government will be worse than a central government in terms of exploiting its own people, in terms of taking away their rights. So it's one of those things where, unfortunately, I shouldn't say unfortunately, I think there's a reality that there's, especially in a federal system, there's some push and some pull when it comes to those kinds of issues. We've talked about that on a federal level, where I've even advocated, I've even argued that I think Trump does have some leeway to say, yep, I'm going to open up the country because what you guys are doing is illegal. What you guys are doing is illegal. So I do have the option to open up the country because you guys don't have the right to do this. You don't have it. You don't have the authority.
Yeah, under the 14th Amendment, what they're doing is arguably unconstitutional. And so what the president needs to do first is take him to court. And then once he has a court order and they say, we're not going to listen to the courts, we're not going to obey the Constitution, then I think he would have justification to move in and prevent them from undermining the Constitution, just as Eisenhower did in the 1950s when the states were not willing to respect Brown versus the Board of Education. But you mentioned the cities, and you made a very good point. You really did call that, and you're very insightful. And so I think to sort of tie this all up, why are these mayors, how did this LA model come about? Because the city charters, which is basically the constitution of your city, the city charters allow the mayors to do this. How are these city charters written so loosely that the mayor can force everybody to stay inside their homes like they're prisoners without any due process, without having to justify himself to the city council, without having to justify himself to the voters? How do
I don't think
allow?
I don't think they can, Pete. I think when these things are challenged later, I think they're going to be overturned badly. I've talked to you off the air. I don't know if we've talked about it on the show before, but there's this thing where they were talking about enforcing quarantine orders on Police One, which I reference a lot on the show, Police One, and it's a great resource if you want to get into the mind of police administrators. And there was this advice that they said in terms of don't use the fishing technique, which the fishing technique is basically, hey, I'm going to stop you on this premise because I can legally stop you for this, but I'm really looking at something else. Like, I think you're a drug dealer. I think you might be involved in burglaries. You're out at the wrong time of night, quote unquote, that kind of a thing. And so it's perfectly legit. It's perfectly legit under the Supreme Court to do this. I can stop you for a broken headlight when I think you might be running drugs. Okay. Because I have a hunch you're running drugs, but I'm stopping you for a broken headlight because you actually have a broken headlight. Okay. Right. And basically, they said specifically, they advised officers, do not do this with these quarantine orders or these curfew orders or whatever variation you have of them. Don't do that. And what that tells me, wink, wink, nod, nod, sort of looking, beyond what the actual statement is that they know that these aren't going to hold up in court. These stops won't hold up in court because they're going to say, yeah, you didn't have the authority you actually didn't have the authority to do that. I really believe that. It's kind of like we've talked about the internment of the Japanese. And remember, at the time, the Supreme Court actually just refused to take the case. And that was something that happened between the Chief Justice and the President, between President Roosevelt and the Chief Justice, where he said, please don't, because Roosevelt knew what he did was unconstitutional. He knew that. So he said, don't take the case. Don't do it. Of course, years later, they did, and they said it was wrong. It was illegal. We had to pay reparations to the Japanese that were interned. There were formal apologies. That took a lot of time later. But guess what? It was never legal. It was never legal under the Constitution to do what we did to the Japanese.
But courts are never required to take up a case. So just because you think you have a case that these orders are illegal, unconstitutional, what have you, there is no guarantee that if we wait, that the courts won't simply say, "Eh, well, that's water under the bridge. We did what he had to do, and we're not going to take it up because that's already happened. That's over. The coronavirus is gone." There's no reason why they can't do that because they can say, "Hey, we have more pressing things on our docket," and dismiss. There's no guarantee. So the sooner we get this into the courts, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but why take the risk? We need to get these lawsuits need to happen now, sooner rather than later. We need to fight now to keep people in business, to protect American businesses, protect American jobs, and to protect our rights, our way of life, our system of government. The idea is that the government works for us, and we mentioned redress of grievances last week. Right now, we have the government doing things that nobody approves of, but there is no mechanism to push back and say, "Hey, this isn't what we hired you to do. This is not what we expected you to do when we elected you."
Especially now because you literally can't get access to these people. We're only talking about 51 people right now, our 50 governors and our president. And who gets access to them?
Right.
The press. That's it. The press are the only people that get access to them. You know, one of the things that's really been a head scratcher for me is why can't we have citizens ask questions of our executives, especially right now, and get rid of these stupid press conferences? Because I could care less what the reporter wants to know or what the reporter thinks I want to know. Why not have people directly? Why not have some doctors, some police officers, have a teenager, have all these different people, different walks of life ask about their questions and their concerns? We were talking earlier, you know, at the beginning of this, beginning of the show, about the circus that Trump's press conferences have become.
Yeah.
Why not allow regular people that are actually affected? Why not have some grocery store workers? How about that? You think they're
Go full Hugo Chavez. Have citizens call in, and I'll answer their questions live on the show.
Hey, if it's good enough for Putin, it's good enough for us.
Oh my gosh, those shows are hilarious, and I'm sad that reality is not as funny as a socialist dictator running his own variety show on Saturday afternoon. But this is where we are.
Indeed.
Well, I think that wraps it up for tonight. And thank you guys for tuning in. We really appreciate it. We appreciate your support, your views. And my name is Pete Maines. I'm here with my co-host Eric Alexander. And until next week, you keep flying free.